It's another pretext for the traditional counterinsurgency type wars. What about inside the United States? Are they fighting a war on drugs here? Of course not. And they know it perfectly well. I mean, study after study has shown that if you want to deal with substance abuse, the most cost-effective way by a huge margin is prevention and treatment. Education, prevention, and treatment. That has big effects on substance abuse. The least effective way, by an orders of magnitude practically, is out-of-country destruction. In fact, interdiction and policing are much less cost-effective than prevention and treatment. But the expenses, and this isn't really controversial, like you read in Rand Corporation reports and so on, but the expenses go the other way. So any reasonable person will conclude whatever's going on here, it's not a war on drugs. So what is it here? Well, my suspicion is that here, too, it's kind of the rich man's counterpart to counterinsurgency. It's the so-called neoliberal program. What's going on here for the last 20 or 25 years is a kind of a version of structural adjustment adapted to a rich country. So it means a substantial part of the population is kind of useless for wealth production. If it's in Colombia, you send death squads out to kill them. We're more civilized. You stick them in jail. Okay. So the incarceration rate has shot up, very closely correlated with drug abuse. A lot of it victimless crimes. Find a kid in Roxbury with a joint or something. So the useless part of the population, surplus population, is you get rid of somehow, like send them to jail. And the rest of the population you frighten. That's a good way of controlling people whose incomes, whose wages have stagnated or declined for about 20 years, who are working far harder than ever before in order to keep stagnant incomes, and who are left out of this very narrow concentration of wealth. Actually, the last 20 years, including the last 10 years, have not been a high growth period. They've been a relatively low growth period in per capita growth. But there has been some growth, and it's highly concentrated. It's for people like us. Most of the population is left out, and they don't like it, and you've got to control them somehow. And the best way of controlling people is fear. Traditional way of controlling people is frighten them of something. Drugs is something you can be frightened about. So you got a kind of a dual system of control, and on those assumptions, the war against drugs makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not declaring meeting the announced objectives. In fact, it's failing them hopelessly. But it is achieving these objectives. So it's only rational to assume that those are the objectives. Actually, I should say there's another question you ought to be asking yourself. Suppose that it was a war on drugs. Suppose that's why we're fumigating peasant farmers in Colombia. Does that legitimate it? I mean, does Colombia have the right to come here and carry out chemical warfare in Kentucky and North Carolina? And why not, after all? Like, more Colombians die of tobacco-related diseases than the number of people who die here of coca-related diseases. If you consider China, huge numbers, tens of millions of people are dying from tobacco-related diseases. Tobacco is far more lethal than hard drugs. We not only produce it, we export it, and we threaten other countries with trade sanctions unless they not only accept our lethal substances, but accept advertising for them, and in fact advertising directed to vulnerable populations, like women and children. The Colombia cartel is not allowed to put up television ads, with some counterpart to Joe Camel saying how much fun it is to us. They can't do that. But free speech would be violated, our noble principles, if tobacco companies weren't allowed to do that in, say, South Korea. Okay, so we're exporting our lethal substances and forcing people to take them, but does that give them the right to carry out helicopter gunship bombing and counterinsurgency operations in Kentucky and North Carolina? None of us think so. So therefore, again, if we're not hypocrites, we think that we don't have the right to do that in Colombia or Bolivia, even if it was destroying drugs. So on the best assumptions you can imagine, it's totally criminal from every possible point of view.
you.